All right, so buckle up, everybody, because today we're going to do a deep dive into some real Cold War intrigue.
Oh, this is going to be good.
It is, we've got the CIA briefing from January 1956.
Okay.
And it basically reveals how the Soviets were looking at Africa and Latin America as like major players in their, quest for global domination.
It's funny. We always think about the Cold War as like this big standoff between the U.S. and the USSR.
Right, like just those two.
Yeah, but this document shows that it was a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
The Soviets were really trying to play a much more subtle game.
So it wasn't just like sending in tanks and troops.
No, not at all. It was more like a charm offensive, I guess you could say.
Okay, I like that, a charm offensive.
Yeah, they used diplomacy, economic incentives, and of course a lot of propaganda.
Of course, gotta have the propaganda.
Right, and this briefing really gives us this inside look to how they tailored their approach to different countries.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were looking for vulnerabilities that they could exploit to gain a foothold.
So let's start with Africa. What was their plan there?
Well, they saw Africa as this huge opportunity, especially with all the anti-colonial sentiment that was spreading across the continent.
Right, like a power vacuum almost.
Exactly, and they jumped right in positioning themselves as allies to all these newly independent nations, offering support and promising a brighter future.
Yeah, free from those pesky Western powers.
Exactly, and what's really interesting is that back in 1945, they actually tried to gain control of Tripolitania.
Tripoli what now?
Tripolitania, it's in modern-day Libya.
Wow, so they were thinking big right from the start.
Oh yeah, they were ambitious, but it obviously didn't work out.
Yeah, Libya wasn't exactly keen on being a Soviet puppet state.
No, they weren't, but it shows you how eager the Soviets were to establish a presence in the region.
Right.
So when Libya finally gained independence in 1955, the Soviets were like right there ready to go.
Like knocking on the door.
Basically, they sent an ambassador, a whole diplomatic team, and they even tried to secure oil concessions.
Of course, gotta have the oil.
Right, and they even asked for permission to use this abandoned airstrip.
So Libya was definitely high on their list of targets.
Oh yeah, no question.
What about other parts of Africa? Did they have luck there?
Well, Liberia was another interesting case. They tried to cozy up to President Tubman.
Tubman, okay.
Yeah, they wanted to sign a friendship treaty with him, offering economic aid and all that.
Dangling the carrot.
Exactly, but Tubman wasn't buying it. He seemed pretty skeptical of their motives.
Yeah, I can see why.
And then there's the Belgian Congo.
Okay, the Congo?
Yeah, the Soviet ambassador to Belgium at the time, a guy named Avalov, managed to get himself invited to tour the Congo.
Oh, I bet the Belgians loved that.
Not so much they were really wary of Soviet intentions.
I can imagine.
And they actually blocked Czechoslovakia and Hungary from sending trade missions there, too.
So it sounds like they had mixed results in Africa.
Yeah, some doors opened, some slammed shut.
Like a game of chess?
Exactly. Every move was calculated to gain influence and outmaneuver the West.
And it seems like they were playing a similar game in Latin America.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, but with a few different twists.
Okay, well, let's shift gears then and head over to Latin America. What was their strategy there?
So in Latin America, they ramped up the propaganda big time. They did a lot of cultural exchanges, and they had this big trade and aid program.
Yeah, trade and aid, that sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? It's like they were reading from today's playbook.
Exactly. So basically, they were trying to find countries that were struggling economically, countries with stuff they couldn't sell anywhere else.
Right, and they would swoop in and offer these amazing deals that the West couldn't match. It was a very clever strategy.
Yeah, it's like there's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
Exactly. They weren't just being generous. They wanted something in return.
Political allies.
Bingo. They wanted to weaken Western influence and gain a foothold in the region.
So what were some specific examples of this?
Well, take Argentina, for example. They had all this surplus agricultural stuff, grain, meat, you name it.
Right.
And the Soviets were like, we'll take it all.
I bet Argentina was pretty happy about that.
Oh, yeah, they were thrilled. And you know what their new ambassador even suggested? Strengthening ties with the USSR?
Wow, so they were really leaning in.
They saw the economic benefits of siding with the Soviet bloc.
Makes sense. A buyer for your surplus goods can suddenly become your new best friend.
You got it. And they did the same thing in Cuba.
Cuba.
Yeah, Cuba had a huge sugar surplus, and the Soviets were more than happy to buy it all up.
So it was a win-win for them, right? They got the sugar they needed, and Cuba got a much-needed economic boost.
Exactly. And on top of that, it actually drove up global sugar prices, which benefited Cuba even more.
Wow, talk about a power move.
Right. And this was all happening way back in the 1950s.
It's crazy to think that they were already thinking so far ahead.
That's what's so fascinating about this briefing. It shows how the Soviets were playing the long game.
Yeah, they weren't just looking for quick wins. They were laying the groundwork for something much bigger.
Exactly. They wanted to create this whole block of nations that were aligned with their ideology and their interests.
So the real prize wasn't just these individual countries. It was the chance to reshape the entire global balance of power.
You got it. They wanted to shake things up, and they saw these emerging nations in Africa and Latin America as key players in that game.
So it wasn't just a head-to-head standoff between the U.S. and the USSR. It was this much more complex, multifaceted conflict playing out all over the world.
Absolutely. And you know what's even more mind-blowing is that a lot of the tactics they used back then are still relevant today.
Yeah, it's like they wrote the playbook for modern geopolitics.
It's true. You see the same stuff happening all the time. Economic incentives, targeted aid packages, strategic alliances.
It really makes you appreciate the importance of understanding history.
Doesn't it? It's not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and anticipating the future.
So this briefing from 1956 might be a historical document, but it's packed with insights that are still relevant today.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that the Cold War wasn't just some distant event. It was a global struggle that continues to shape the world we live in.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Soviet activities in Africa and Latin America, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the Cold War was truly a global conflict. And to really understand it, you have to look beyond the traditional centers of power.
And what about the long-term impact of these early Soviet efforts? Did they achieve their goals?
That's a tough question to answer. I mean, the Soviet Union might be gone, but the aftershocks of their Cold War activities are still being felt in many parts of the world.
Yeah, it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. The relationships they built, the alliances they forged for rivalries, they fueled all of that continues to influence geopolitics today.
It makes you wonder if we're still grappling with the legacy of the Cold War.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this briefing gives us a glimpse into the roots of those tensions. It shows how these early maneuvers helped set the stage for the complex geopolitical landscape we see today.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to a different side of the Cold War.
It's a reminder that history isn't just a bunch of dates and names. It's a living force that continues to shape our world.
Yeah, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, are we still living in the shadow of the Cold War?
In a way, I think we are. I mean, those ripples are still spreading out.
It's like those events from decades ago are still shaping the world today.
Exactly. And the CIA briefing, it's like a snapshot of that moment, right when everything was starting to shift.
Yeah, it's like looking through a time capsule.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, I want to leave our listeners with a question.
Okay, I like a good question.
So think about it this way. This briefing from 1956, it captures this pivotal moment when the world was in flux, right?
Right.
So how did those early Soviet efforts, the alliances they made, the rivalries they created, how did all of that shape the world in the decades that followed?
That's a good question.
And how does that history continue to influence global power structures today?
Wow, those are some deep thoughts.
It really makes you realize that history isn't just some boring old subject. It's a living, breathing force that's still shaping the world around us.
Absolutely. And documents like this CIA briefing, they give us this incredible glimpse into the past,
They help us understand the forces that have shaped our present and the forces that will continue to shape our future.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey back in time. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into the Cold War's lesser-known battlegrounds.
It's been my pleasure, and to our listeners, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep peeling back the layers of history. You never know what you might discover.
And on that note, we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the archives.